And thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. Michigan Virtual's efforts include providing online courses to K-12 students across Michigan and the United States, as well as providing a variety of professional learning opportunities for educators focused on innovative educational practices such as blended learning, providing resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. And today we are very lucky to have Charles Graham and Jered Borum talking about their K-12 blended teacher readiness instrument and the development of it in their phase 1 part of the project. So Charles and Jered, I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right, thank you. This is Charles. Mary and Randy, glad to have you here, and whoever will be watching this asynchronously after the webinar. Just by way of introduction, I'm a faculty member at Brigham Young University, and I've been studying blended learning for over a decade now, but most of my blended learning research has focused on the K-12 or the higher ed realm, while Jered has done a lot of work in the K-12 realm. Recently, my interest in K-12 blended learning was piqued as, I work in a school of education, and our state board of education added a couple new rules to the licensure requirements. And so this kind of piqued my interest. They added these two rules, 3 and 4, that our teachers need to have coursework designed to help them teach effectively in the online-only and blended classrooms, in addition to the traditional classroom, and also to help them learn how to facilitate student use of software for personalized learning. So kind of my journey was, after seeing that, we're trying to develop a course to help students, K-12 pre-service teachers, learn how to teach in a blended context and online context. So we went out and started looking for, well, what are the competencies that are needed? And that kind of got me interested in this, and also helped me to see that there was a gap here that needed to be filled. Jered, why don't I let you introduce yourself and kind of where you're coming at?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Jered. I'm at George Mason University, which is in Virginia, just outside of D.C. I actually was a PhD student at BYU, and Charles was my dissertation chair, so it's been nice to reconnect and work on this project. So Charles focuses largely in his position right now in teacher preparation, and I'm working in a program. It's a graduate level program that's the blended and online learning in schools, and I also do a lot of PD work with Fairfax County Public Schools, which is one of the largest school districts in the country. And so that's really what got us thinking about what exactly are the competencies. Fairfax County Public Schools was rolling out with a one-to-one initiative, and so they actually reached out to Mason to try to get some support on how they might leverage the one-to-one initiative to have more blended classrooms in their school district. And so, so like I said, I'm really interested in it because of that. Let's start with doing some introductions. If you wouldn't mind taking just a moment in the chat box, or you can grab the microphone and just explain your current position and your involvement with online and blended learning. I'm going to let Mary go first. Ladies first.
That works. I think Mary wasn't sure that her microphone was working, so.
Okay. So while you're typing, Mary, so I'll just introduce myself. Randy Lavonte. I'm CEO working with the Canadian E-Learning Network. I'm all of one in terms of who's involved in the network. Michael Barber has been an active involvement. I have to recognize him certainly as being part of why we formed the national network. We're not a NACOL North. We are sort of a network of our own for blended and online, and actually also do the State of the Nation research, which you fellows are, most of you are always all familiar with. Oh,
Yeah,
can you
yeah.
hear me? Sorry.
Yep.
Jered, you hearing me just fine? Thumbs up? Okay, so probably on the back of that. Sorry. Anyway, so, and I'm very interested in this particular session and what you're doing here, because one of the things that we want to do in Canada through the CandyLearn network is to create a series of micro-credential skill-based components for teachers who need to teach blended and online. And then we'll negotiate some learning recognition in some of the post-secondary programs that a lot of people navigate to. So still in the idea conception, it's a question of finding the groundwork to go forward. And like you indicated, Charles, that in Utah, in terms of the directives and initiatives, there are some of the online programs in school districts that are now filling the gaps from post-secondary and have training programs for teachers. Very interested in what you guys have found and also that dialogue.
That's great. That's interesting work. And so Mary, I know Mary well in part because she's done some work with one of my PhD students here with what he's doing with blended learning in his classroom. So thank you for introducing yourself, Mary. And Mary also has an upcoming special issue for JOLR, the Journal of Online Learning Research, with student diverse students in online and blended learning. Okay, great. So this is actually a couple of resources that we'd like to direct you to. These hyperlinks work if you want to click on them, but we have a report that we published along with Ross Larson, who is at Brigham Young University, professor there, and Emily Pullum, who's an excellent PhD student at Brigham Young University. So that's out. You can access that. If we recommend doing that, especially if you want to see the items. They're located there, and we've also done a podcast if you want to listen to that, which is more of a conversation that we had with Justin at MVLRI. So it feels like, and Randy, you touched on this as well, that there's a couple obstacles that we face when we're trying to develop professional development. One thing that we need to remember is a lot of these teachers are not being prepared by their teacher preparation programs, and that's changing. But right now, the reality is that they're not being prepared. So there needs to be a lot of professional development work that needs to be done. And so when we were looking at that, we've identified two kind of challenges. One is there's no established framework of competencies that we can point to and that we can use as a foundation for the design work that we're doing. The other thing is we need to have measures that we're confident in to be able to assess where teachers are and also if our PD has been effective, and we can measure their growth. There's instruments that are available that have been created by researchers but haven't been validated, and so we really want to validate it so that we're confident that we're actually measuring what we think we measure. So we'll talk about that process here, but in part we want an instrument that's been peer reviewed both by experts and practitioners. We also want to make sure statistically that we can show that we're actually measuring different constructs that map back to the framework that we've identified. So our primary goal is to create an open source, an open resource that people can use. There's been some really interesting work done to create a framework and to validate an instrument, but it isn't open. And so one thing that we wanted to do is find something that's open and create something that's open and share it freely with school districts, school level administrators, even teachers themselves, and researchers especially. So in order to do that, we also needed to create the framework that we hope can be used for professional development, to kind of guide the development of professional development for pre-service and in-service teachers. Yeah, Randy, that's a really good point, that that competency framework is really foundational. And we also looked at the ISTE standards. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the other thing we wanted was something for blended teaching specifically. And so when you're looking at fields such as ours, we've kind of struggled to define terms, to establish frameworks and models. In higher education, oftentimes, they've been doing it a little bit longer. And so we're just kind of really looking to define these terms in ways that can be accepted by the field. When we look at the definition for blended learning, this is the most widely cited definition for blended learning by the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is a strategic combination of online and face-to-face learning with some element of student control over time, place, path, or pace, which is one reason why we see blended and personalized learning, that pairing, quite often. One thing that we know is that blended teaching requires competencies that are different from face-to-face and online teaching. So that's one challenge that we had, as Randy mentioned, is we saw some competencies for face-to-face or for online, but we really saw blended teaching as something different. And so while those were insightful, it wasn't exactly what we're looking for. And in fact, there's very little research that has looked to identify K-12 best practices in the blended classroom. So if you guys wouldn't mind, in the chat window, if you could just type in what you think, in your opinion, what are the major challenges that teachers face when they look to move from a traditional face-to-face class to teaching a blended class? Randy, yes. I think that a lot of teachers get pretty nervous about the technology, or they're so focused on the technology that they don't think about the pedagogy. Ashton, that's exactly right. A lot of times you give them the technology and then they don't rethink what their practice in the classroom, and so essentially they're digitizing what they've already been doing. Yeah, Mary, that's a great point. I mean, getting them to see that they can now do other things, right? I mean, if you provide instruction online and face-to-face, that can actually free up some time and provide some flexibility for teachers to work with students in different ways. Yeah, and Catherine, you're right. I mean, a lot of times they're just not offered PD opportunities like they should be. Yeah, yeah, Catherine, I think you mentioned that. Good. Okay, yeah. I mean, getting the technology to do what you want, Randy. I mean, that's a big part of it. So continue. Right, right. So I mean, it's really complicated because you need then to consider the content that they're teaching, the the technology and the pedagogy all at once, and it can be quite complicated. So when we had these discussions, we actually talked a lot about what are the differences between tech integration, online teaching, and blended teaching competencies. And in part, it involves the scope. And so when you look at traditional education, we've let me go back here. We've created this matrix, or this matrix that has these 4 quadrants, and in quadrant 1 is the human interaction that is technology mediated. So that's the human interaction with learner-learner or learner content, or sorry, learner-instructor. And then down in quadrant 3, I think I need to get my arrow. Down in quadrant 3, we see the non-tech mediated interaction. So this is traditional face-to-face interaction. In this area right here, we have learner content interactions. Am I doing that? Am I doing that? Sorry. I don't know what's going on there. Okay. We have learner content interactions. This can be non-digital, or it can be digital. And when you look at digital content, there's a wide range. We have static or data poor in that it's not really providing the instructor with any data or students with any data. An example of that might be a website or wiki pages. It's not really adapting to the visitor necessarily, and it's not really pushing out data to anybody, the teacher, or providing it to students. Then you have educational apps, simulations. You also have adaptive software that are really responsive to what students are doing and providing a lot of rich data to instructors. So when we look at traditional education, we see that we're really down in quadrants 3 and 4. So you have human interaction, you have content interaction, but it's not really mediated by technology. When you look at online teaching competencies, we're really focused on the skills to communicate in a mediated environment or to facilitate those communications in a mediated environment, and then also to facilitate learner interactions online with the digital content with some non-digital content as well. But the focus is really on quadrants 1 and 2 for the most part. When you look at tech integration, it's kind of flipped. A lot of times you'll see some online content, but oftentimes that's teacher use with some student use. But also there's a primary focus on the face-to-face interaction and a lot of the non-digital content as well. But when you're looking at blended teaching competencies, you really need to consider all 4 of the quadrants, and which makes this such a challenging process for teachers, is that they're really having to do all of these things and to consider all of these opportunities for their students. And for us, when we're defining competencies, it can be quite challenging because we also have to consider all of these things. When you're looking at the models of blended learning, here we have K-12 and then higher education. In higher education, they focus really on the replacement model. I know that a lot of institutions, they actually define blended learning by how much of the face-to-face class time is replaced with online activities. And so you can actually call up universities and ask them how many blended courses are you offering, and they could probably tell you that. In the K-12 area, we have more responsibility to supervise students with adolescents and children. And so we actually are seeing a lot of rotation models where The seat time is not replaced, and students are kind of rotating between stations in the classroom, or the flip model where they're learning at home and then they're coming to the classroom. Or these flex models where students are learning a lot. Most of the material is delivered online, but students are in a brick and mortar setting and they're receiving face-to-face support as needed. And then you also see kind of enriched virtual where students are learning remotely for the most part with some supplemental face-to-face support. So we definitely see a continuum here, and so this is another challenge that you face when you're trying to identify competencies of blended teaching, is that there's so many different models, especially at the K-12 area.
Can I just add one thing there? What we're seeing in K-12 is the rotation models are the most common right now, while in higher ed, these replacement models are the ones that are most common. So what blended teaching competency frameworks are you aware of? Mary and Randy, are you aware of any frameworks that are out there? Just want to type in the screen. Okay, so Mary says INACOL. That's right. INACOL does have a competency framework that they have published. We'll talk about that. Randy mentioned that one too. That's probably the most, the one that people are most aware of. Randy said he created one for BC teachers based on the community of inquiry model. That's great. I'd love to see that, Randy. If you'd like to email it to me, share it with me. Looks like Mary is typing in something else. We'll see if she's aware of another one. I know several people who are working on one, but they gave up. It is really hard, we've found. I can resonate with that. So let me show you kind of some of the pre-work that we did to developing the model. We conducted an extensive lit review and found, first of all, that there's limited peer review research on K-12 blended teaching competencies. I mean, even the INACOL model, which is probably the most well-known, it is not validated in any way with research. We expanded our review to include some white papers and reports from professional organizations like INACOL and the Clayton Christensen Institute, and we also included a framework from the Learning Accelerator that we found to be quite detailed. We ended up with 8 source documents in all that we analyzed, and we'll show you some of this analysis in subsequent slides, just so that you get a sense for what some of those models look like. This is the INACOL model that was mentioned. So their blended teaching competencies has mindsets, qualities, adaptive skills, technical skills, and these are the sub-constructs in each of those areas. Oliver has a blended profile. This is the one that Jered was referring to earlier that is proprietary, so can't really be used openly. And theirs follows a kind of more process-oriented model with instruction, professional responsibilities, technology, planning and preparation, curriculum, and instructional design. And as I've looked through that one of the things, we actually have a paper that we're working on right now that talks about the specificity of the items. And most of the items in this one, many of the items in this one, most I would say, are generic. They're not specific to a blended context. And so that's a little bit problematic in some of the models that we've found. The IBSTIPI, this is an organization by ACT that had a pretty structured framework. And you can see that they have, it's kind of process oriented too. The problem with this model was it wasn't K-12 focused, and it was also not created specifically for blended teaching. So it was, they tried to create a more generic model that could be used across all three modalities. So what we did, Emily, one of the co-authors on this, was very instrumental in this, went through all 8 source documents and coded each competency statement and created kind of a bigger picture of where the patterns were in all of those competency statements. This was just to kind of guide us at the outset. I know you can't see this. I'm going to do some pullouts of these. So in the pedagogy realm, you can see the coding categories that came out. The majority had to do with flexibility and personalization, things like, you know, helping teachers learning how to do variable pacing, scheduling, mastery-based learning. So you can see some of the pedagogy issues there that came out in those 8 competency documents. In the management area, you can see some of the things, you know, classroom management like behavior monitoring, discipline, integrating online and face-to-face elements, parental involvement. So these are the codings for the ones that are supposed to be in these blended specific competencies. And so you can see many of them are fairly generic. The next big categories had to do with assessment and technology. So data usage, being able to review student process, competencies related to general assessment or formative assessment skills, providing timely feedback, authentic assessments. These were some of the competencies that we saw related to assessment. And then in the technology realm, things related to LMS, learning LMS skills, software management, hardware management, and then some troubleshooting skills. Looks like we have a couple of comments here about the TPAC model and the community of inquiry. I'm intimately familiar with both of those. I've done quite a bit of publishing on TPAC, and while it has some strengths too, it is not specific to blended, what doesn't really provide specific guidance there. And it has some of its own limitations that I'd be happy to talk with you about later or send you some articles on. The last areas that there were fewer competencies on: instructional design, dispositions, improvement, and then some that had to do with academic credentials. So that's the general, the big picture when we're looking at the competencies that are out there that currently exist. So our research process, our instrument development process involved reviewing all the existing frameworks that we could find, then developing our own competency structure that was informed by those, developing items for the constructs within that structure, soliciting external expert feedback, and then soliciting feedback from our district administrators and practicing school teachers. This is the initial model that we came up with, the structural model for our blended teaching readiness. We had a set of foundational skills which involved technological literacy, digital citizenship, and dispositions. We had planning skills and competencies specific to planning blended activities and planning blended assessments. Then we had instructional methods and strategies, which is our biggest category. We have things related to personalizing instruction, items related to facilitating student-student interaction, student-instructor interaction, and then student interaction with content. And then we have a section on assessment and evaluation, skills for implementing blended assessments, and then also on evaluating and reflecting on their teaching. So these are the major categories. This is the measurement model that we had. We had 57 items in this model. You can see the subconstructs and the number of items. Each of the subconstructs had 5 items, except for there were 2 subconstructs with 6 items. You can see in this report, if you click on the link, go down to the bottom of the report, you can see the actual items themselves for each of these constructs, and I would recommend that you do that. Once we had a model that we felt good about, and we had gotten feedback from experts and from district administrators and from our teachers, we went through several iterations and adaptations and honing, and so we ended up with our final model. We administered the instrument to a set of teachers in a large school district back east, and we had 218 participants that helped us with kind of this validation process. This is some data on where they were at in terms of their own blended teaching experience. One thing that we want you to recognize is that only about half of the participants in the district have any experience at all with blended teaching. And the majority that had experience with blended teaching were on the low end of years. They're just barely getting into it. They're novice in their experience with blended teaching. And then those that have, one of our thoughts was that maybe we would have people who have a lot of experience with online teaching would help with the blended teaching in the districts. And that wasn't our experience, at least with this district. The majority that were involved had no experience with online teaching. So that kind of helped us to understand where we were coming, where many of the teachers would be coming from. These are the fit statistics that we ran for. So this is the, we created a structural model and did structural equation modeling. We created the structural model that you saw. There's 4 different fit statistics that you can run on a structural model. And generally, the more of the fit statistics that you can get to fit with your model, the stronger the model is, and the more confidence you can have in the model that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. So in our initial run of the data, we had good fit on 2 of the fit statistics and close but poor fit on 2 of the other fit statistics. So you have a cutoff. It's kind of like a p-value. You have a cutoff, and if you're above that value, that threshold, then you have good fit, and if you are not, then you have poor fit. So we went back with Ross Larson, who is our methodologist, looked at our model, removed 2 items that were not functioning very well, and with those 2 items removed, we got good fit across all of the 4 models, which we were quite surprised about, to be able to do that in the first round of measurement. So the question was, how many districts? All this data was being collected from one district, from multiple schools within that district, a pyramid within that district, so high school, and then the junior highs and elementary schools within that pyramid. So in the process, we learned quite a few things. A couple of things that we learned were that there was some areas of weakness in our, because we requested feedback from the teachers who took the instrument too. One of the areas that we felt was an area of weakness was the management skills, the classroom management in a blended context. So in phase 2, we plan to add, we're in the process of doing this right now, adding a management construct that focuses on managing the learning environment itself and then also managing learning routines with the environment, which is a big deal with blended context, especially where you're switching back and forth between learning in online modality and face-to-face direct instruction. We also were trying to be a little more internally consistent with a terminology. Now, this is an area that's fluctuating a lot. There's, it's a evolving area. So some of the things that we have been thinking about are, when we're talking about interactions, it makes sense to talk about online and in-person interactions. But when we're talking about content itself, it doesn't make sense to talk about in-person, for example, materials or in-person assessments. And so in those contexts, we've gone to the term online and offline. In the tech integration realm, we see the term digital and non-digital being used much more readily. We've opted to use online rather than digital because digital is such a broad term that it encompasses all of the tech integration things that we think are great, but are also not part of how we're conceptualizing blended teaching. One other thing that I wanted to share with you is a simplified model that we're working on. So we're working in parallel on 2 models. The phase 1 model is quite extensive. So ultimately, there's going to be, we had 55 items, so there'll be 65 items in that. So it's a pretty long instrument. We're also trying to create an instrument that's a little more simplified and focused on some of the most core skills, less of a process model, and focusing on the core pedagogical skills within a blended context. And those have to do with integration, so integrating how they're choosing and making the rationales for integrating the online and the face-to-face instruction that they're doing. The technology-mediated interaction, so their skills and competencies with interacting with people in the online space, their ability to personalize instruction, and then looking at real-time data practices, since that's a big part of how assessment and instruction is happening in a blended context, is their ability to take data from the online context and use that data to inform what's happening in the face-to-face or in-person context and vice versa. Are there any questions about this so far before I go on to kind of share our next steps about the model or the instrument that was created? Mary or Randy, any questions? Yeah, Randy says, I need to process this. It's true. There's a lot here. This represents a year's worth of work by multiple people, measurement. So yeah, it's a lot to process. Please feel free to reach out to us after the presentation if you have questions. We'd love your input. We're still preparing the phase 2 models to be tested at the early next year. And so we'd love any input that you have. Our next steps, we want to finalize and validate the new instrument that includes the new management items. We want to be able to use the instrument to measure our teacher needs and readiness. So part of our vision is that the readiness instrument could actually be used to help create more focused and targeted professional development for the teachers. So if there's skills that they already have or they're stronger in, they can focus, we can point them to, direct them to professional development that's more targeted to the needs that they have. We feel like this is especially important in this area where there's limited professional development time and limited time for, in a pre-service context, for students to take more classes and to expand the curriculum. Randy says, or Junga commented, what were the items removed? I don't remember right off, but if you go to the MVLRI report, it lists those 2 items in there, the items that were removed, I believe. Step 2 would be interesting, Randy says, like assessing your readiness to learn online. This will lead to training PD programs that accomplish this. That's exactly right. We're trying to create a mechanism that will allow us to personalize blended teaching professional development, right? So we're not just giving a one-size-fits-all, but if we know where people are at or where a school is at or a group is at, we can personalize the professional development to those needs. Step 3 is to use the framework to develop some professional development series. And some of the things that we're dealing with a little bit in thinking about that is there'll be a need to be able to differentiate that professional development based on age and content. So the kinds of blends that would happen with an elementary classroom are maybe quite different or look different from the kind of blends that you would see in a high school social studies classroom. And then, of course, we are interested in professional in research. So we would be interested in setting up studies to actually study the implementation of professional development with pre-service and in-service teachers to see if it's helping in the adoption of blended learning and also if it's helping move the needle on improving teacher abilities in this area. So I think that's where we're at. Jered's responding to a couple of the questions there in the chat space. If you have any other questions or comments, Jered, feel free to turn your microphone on and maybe you can respond to some of the questions that have been listed here. We have another Mary who's shown up. Mary 2.
Yeah, so Junga, you brought up about looking at how this would impact their students, and I was working with a school district that they brought that up on another project where we were talking about teacher professional development, but they wanted to know what is the impact in the classroom. And so I think that's definitely an area of research that we need more of.
Yeah, I think that is really important. It's also something that's a little harder to get at if you don't know what the teachers are actually doing in the classroom. So I think it's a great point. It's kind of probably a staging, right? Ultimately, we want to get to if teachers have these competencies, is it making a difference with student learning in the classroom?
And to find the right measure for student learning or student outcomes, right? The district I was speaking with, they wanted to know if it impacted the standardized test scores, which may not be it's understandable why they want to look at that, but that may not be the right measure when you're looking at it either.
Yeah, Mary says, what I'd use this for right now is planning my courses. So what does my teacher education practice have to look at to foster the competencies? And I think that's, Mary, you're right on with where we're at too. I mean, at the beginning of this presentation, I shared that we have a mandate within the state of Utah to provide coursework that helps our students learn how to teach in a blended context. That's part of the licensure requirements. And so we're trying to figure that out. We're developing, that was one of the things that instigated us wanting to look at this issue and being able to find competencies that are specific to blended teaching, are not generic competencies. I mean, a lot of the competencies, things that we've found, we have an article we're working on with this to document this. But a lot of the competencies would say things like, know how to provide feedback to students. And for us, while that's really important that they know how to provide feedback, it's not specific enough to develop blended teaching instruction on, right? Because the way you would provide feedback in a blended context is very different from the way you might provide feedback in a fully online context or in a face-to-face only context. So we're looking for competencies that are specific to blended teaching and to that the integration of online and in-person instruction. I would say, we would love collaborations, around this. If you're working on this in your institution, we'd love to collaborate with you. We're in the process of also trying to develop some professional development, create an open source text that can be used with the professional development that focuses on these blended teaching skills.
The other thing that we've talked about is the instrument that we developed follows kind of the process of teaching in a blended environment. So going from planning to facilitating to assessing and evaluating. One thing that we kind of like about phase 2 and working on the simplified structure is you have themes that are more cross-cutting and may actually help more when you're designing a course as well, when you have something like personalization. That would include planning, facilitating, and assessment. But that, or technology-mediated interaction or real-time data practices, those may be more helpful things when you're designing courses, a course or a series of courses.
Mm-hmm. Catherine asks if we're looking for partners, and I would say yes. I mean, within this validation process, we have some partners lined up, but in this validation process, the more people that we can get to take the instrument and to do across lots of different contexts, the better off we are. So if you are working with a district or would like to use the instrument, please let us know, and we'd be happy to let you see it. Any other questions? Thank you, Randy, for your comment about the framework simplicity. There's always a balance when you create a model. There's this balance between comprehensiveness and parsimony or simplicity, right? And we struggled a lot with trying to figure out how to manage that balance, because all models have to struggle with that. And we think that the model that we shared with you is a really solid model maybe a little more towards the comprehensiveness side. And the simplified model that we're developing is a follow-up model that we think is also important, but will be a little less comprehensive, but a little more on the parsimonious side. So,
yeah, Randy, please keep in touch and let us know.
Anyway, that's what we have, and we appreciate your contribution and questions. Great questions. Please feel free to reach out to us, contact us. Like we said at the beginning, our goal in this is to further knowledge, research, further people's ability as well as our own ability to improve teachers who are trying to learn how to teach in future classrooms that will almost invariably involve blended learning. So we're open to whatever collaborations that will help push that agenda.
I would just
forward.
invite anyone listening to the recording, please don't hesitate to email us. Our email addresses are there.
Thank you both, Charles and Jered, for your contributions today. Just like Randy said, I think all of our heads are spinning. Mine's still spinning from having read the report not too long ago when it was submitted for publication for your fellows' directives. So we really appreciate your time and energy and effort with your collaborators on this very important project. And I believe our professional learning services team has probably a good number of blended schools within Michigan that might be willing to participate in this next round of validation processes. So we'll definitely be in touch about that. And Charles and Jered, if you could put your email addresses into the chat box as well, that might be good, because I'm going to move to the next slide just in case people have not copied those down yet. So we have a couple of options for you to get involved with Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. Actually, a few. You can always get in touch with us if you have a webinar you'd like to schedule to share your important work. We also have a podcast, Virtual Viewpoints, where you can share your information there, as well as through our blog, where we have a guest blogger program where you can get paid to write for us to share your research. So we hope you can get involved in that. We also have another upcoming webinar with Kevin Heller, who is a recent graduate with his PhD. He is at the University of California's UC Scout program, and he is looking at the use of the INACOL standards, which we were just talking about, for online classes. So he'll be coming in on December 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully you can join us then. And as always, you can contact us in a number of different ways shown here: email, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. You can sign up for our mailing list. And of course, this webinar is being recorded and will be available probably in the next 24 to 48 hours via our YouTube channel. So we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you again to Charles and Jered, and for our very active participants, Mary and Randy. We look forward to seeing you guys in another episode. Have a good rest of your